Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, we are going to sew together block number 11 of my 12-part sew-along. If you're new to my channel, I would love it if you would subscribe. Subscribing costs you nothing, but it lets me know that you are interested in the videos that I'm uploading, and YouTube will let you know when I upload my next video. Now, this is block number 11 of a 12-part series, so there are 10 other blocks out there on my channel already ready for you to sew together if you are new to the sew-along. Block number 12 will be coming pretty soon, and once that's done, we'll be putting some sashing and borders on our quilt top so that we have a nice cuddly and cozy lap quilt. And the other fun thing to know is that all 12 of the blocks that I'm choosing for this sampler quilt are actually coming from this book. I have a limited number of these in my Etsy shop, and there's a link to that store in the description box below if you want to pick one up. But you don't need to buy this book in order to put any of the blocks together, because in this video, as well as all of the others, I'm actually going to walk you through step by step how to sew each of the blocks. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. So the pattern that we're going to do this time is called Air Castle, and it is pattern number 1 in our block. And the reason why I picked this is because I really like kind of this three-dimensional feel that we get when these fabrics surround that center square. It looks like our pattern is going to consist of some background fabric and then 2 contrasting or coordinating prints. You'll need something for the center and a little poke of color around it, and then you'll need another color to just kind of give it that third dimension feel. The cutting instructions for this do look pretty simple. However, I have found when the book tells us to cut a square and then cut it on the diagonal once or twice, those units are measuring just a little bit shy, and it's causing problems with my finished block. So what I'm going to do is take their cutting instructions for the 12-inch block, and any unit that they want us to cut on the diagonal, I'm just going to cut my block at a full 1/4 inch above what they are telling us to do. So here are all the cutting instructions. I'm going to put it up on the screen in front of you. We're going to cut from our background fabric 2 squares at 5 1/8 inches, and then we're going to cut that on the diagonal once so that you end up with 4 triangles. Also from our background fabric, we're going to cut 1 square at 5 1/2 inches, and we're going to cut that on the diagonal twice so that we end up with 4 smaller triangles. Then from the print that we want to use in the center of the block, we're going to first cut a square at 4 1/2 inches, and that's our center square, so we don't need to cut it on the diagonal. We're going to leave it alone. And then we're going to cut 1 square at 5 1/2 inches and cut that on the diagonal twice. And then finally, we just need to cut that darker green to give it that three-dimensional feel. And so what we're going to do is cut 4 squares at 5 1/8 inch and cut all of that on the diagonal once so that you end up with 8 triangles. Okay, that's pretty simple, right? A little bit more cutting than last time, but this block should go together pretty easily. The hardest part, of course, is always picking our fabric. So let's look at the batiks that I haven't touched yet and figure out which ones we're going to use for this block. We're kind of winding down here, and I have a fat quarter that I haven't used at all, and so I think it's time to probably break this out. This is a nice dark green, and so I think I might want to use this for the darker green that's actually in the illustration in the book, and then I want a good print that'll coordinate with that. But I have to make sure that I choose something that has a decent amount of yardage in it. So I think what I'm going to do is use this as the lighter green, and so my block's actually going to kind of look a little bit like what the illustration is. These are the fabrics that I'm going to use, and of course we need some background. Let's cut my background piece first. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just kind of get my fabric up here, and from my background I'm going to cut 2 squares at 5 1/8 inch. I do have 2 layers on my table, so I'm going to end up cutting this a little bit bigger, and then I will trim it down to size. All right, I want this to be at 5 1/8. Now for this one, it says we do need to cut them on the diagonal just once so that we have 4 triangles. So I'm going to make sure that I'm going 45 degrees and cut. We need 4 squares of this, measuring at 5 1/8. So I'm actually going to leave this fabric folded a bit. I'm going to fold this so that it's got 4 layers on it, and that'll just make my cutting a little bit more efficient. And we need to cut 4 of these at 5 1/8. I am going to measure this at about 5 1/2, and then I will cut it down. All right, now I know this is a good 90-degree edge, so I can line that up with my 5 1/8 and just clean up the right and the top. Here are the 4 squares that I need, and it says we're going to cut this on the diagonal just once, from corner to corner. There is our dark, and now it's time to cut our light. This one we need to cut just 1 4 1/2 inch square. Looks like I haven't used much of this one either, so that's good. Use up some of these greens. This 4 1/2 inch square doesn't need to be cut in the diagonal because this is going to go in the middle of our block. Then we need to cut 1 square at 5 1/2 inches and cut that on the diagonal twice. And again, I'm going to cut this a little bit bigger. I'll square it up, and then I'll cut it on the diagonal. All of our cutting's done. That was super simple. Now we just get to do the fun part, which is sewing and then trimming down. Let's get to it. Sewing with triangles can be a little tricky, and the first step we're going to do is sew our small background triangle and our small light green triangle. This is the one that matches your center square. Take a look down at the map. When you're working with triangles, you can sew them a bunch of different ways and you'll get different units. If I sew them along that long edge, then I have a square, and this is known as your half square triangle. This is a very common block in quilting. We don't want that. If I sew them with the points of the top, the peaks of the triangles going in opposite directions, then I get like this parallelogram. I don't know what that's called. Is that the right name for this shape? But you kind of get like this trapezoid or whatever shape this is called, where the sides are slanted up. We don't want that either. What we actually want to do is have the peaks of the triangles both pointing towards the center and sew along the short edge so that when this is together, we're basically making another triangle. Do you see how that's another triangle there? That's what we want to make. But we want to make 4 exactly like this. So when we put this through our machine, we want to make sure that we're taking just a minute to orient all of our fabrics so that they're all going the same exact way, so that we're not messing this up or getting confused with which way the directions go of the fabric. This will save you some time with Jack and some frustration in the end. So the trick here is that the long edges go out and the points or the peaks of your triangles point down. So we're going to take all of these to the machine and we're going to sew just like this. Remember, be very careful about how you're orienting your seams. Whichever way you do it, you want to make sure you repeat that each time. And of course, as always, as you're sewing some of these seams together, you're going to want to be careful because some of those edges are bias edges, and all that means is that they're stretchy. They have a little bit more give. And so if you're tugging or putting any tension on your fabric as the machine's trying to pull it in, you're going to you're going to risk stretching out or distorting your fabric. So just be a little careful there. When I'm sewing, I'm letting the machine do all of the work. I'm just providing a very, very light fingertip touch on my fabric Just to kind of guide the fabric into the machine, make sure that it's going in straight. All I'm doing is steering the fabric in as it approaches my presser foot. The machine's pulling the fabric in and doing all of the other work. Just a tip for you, to sew straight, you don't want to look at the needle and where it's actually sewing. You want to look at where the fabric is approaching the foot of your machine. That's where you're going to have the greatest control and be able to fix it if the fabric's going crooked. Now that I have all of these little quarter square triangles, we're going to open them up, and I'm going to take a minute just to finger press them towards the darker fabric. If your background's black, then you're probably going to finger press to the black background, but since I'm working with a white background, these are going to get finger pressed towards the green side. All that means is I'm going to lay it so that the green is on top, and I'm going to put my fingers through and just kind of crease that down the middle so that the seam bulk at the back is all going to the green side. There we go. I'm going to take a second to use a hot dry iron to really set that seam. Now I'm going to take these 4 units and I'm going to take 4 of my large dark green triangles and I'm going to sew them together. Let's take a look. We're going to orient these so that these units make an actual square. So what we're going to do is take the unit we just made and the unit that we cut, and we're going to put them together and sew them on that long seam so that it makes a square. Now when you do this, you just want to make sure that your peaks are matched in the center here. So I'm looking at the tip here to make sure that those are lined up. And then I want to make sure that the fabric along the sides is running parallel to the edges. If you have something like I do where you've got a little bit extra from the piece that you sewed together, don't use this piece on the bottom as your seam allowance guide. Use the fabric on top because we know this is the right size. The reason why you might have an overhang is honestly just because we cut those pieces too big so that we could size them down later. If you find that your fabric doesn't really want to cooperate with how it's laying, don't force it with your fingertips. Instead, scratch it with your fingernails. That's going to help push the fibers where it needs to be to get everything lined up without distorting your fabric. If this extra overhang bothers you, you can always trim that off with a rotary cutter, but honestly, it's not going to add that much bulk to our project, so I'm going to leave it. Now what I'm going to do is open each of these up and finger press it towards that solid triangle because it's the darker of the two. And then we'll take it to a hot dry iron and press these so that they're nice and flat. And then we'll trim them down to 4.5 inches. Before we size these down, we're going to make some more half square triangle units and then we'll just size everything down all together because everything is going to have to be trimmed down to 4.5 inches. So take a look down here. We're going to take our 4 remaining green triangles and our 4 remaining background triangles and we're going to sew them together along this long edge, and that's going to make 4 squares. And the tip for this one, just like the other one, is when you're matching up your triangles, make sure the peaks of those triangles match up first and then sew it together. If it's not laying nicely on top of one another, use your fingernails to scratch it into place. Then we're going to take these and finger press them to the dark side and then press them with a hot dry iron. Then we'll size everything down to 4.5 inches. All right, let's get to trimming. Remember that this line in here between where that dark fabric and the other fabric that we sewed it to, that should be running at 45 degrees. So we just want to find the 45-degree line on our ruler and make sure that it's sitting right on top of that seam. That's going to help make sure that that seam starts and ends in the corner of our block, making it a crisp and clean half square triangle unit. Even if it looks like there isn't anything for you to clean off, it's always a good idea to run your rotary blade against it anyway, because at least then that way you're going to get your dog ears. Okay, now we have all of our pieces sized down to 4.5 inches. Let's take a look down below and see how we put this together. We know that this piece is going to go in the center, so we're just going to lay it here and work around it. The diagram has it set up so that in the four corners, we have our half square triangle units that have our darker color and our background, and the background, of course, is going in the corners. So that's pretty easy. Let's just go ahead and fill that in. So when we do that, it kind of looks a little bit like a churn dash, but what we're going to do is take these units and put them in these four spots, and it's going to give the block a whole different look. So the way we're going to do this is starting in the top, we're going to take our unit and orient it so that the background is at the top and it's pointing towards the middle. And we're going to do that on all four pieces. We're going to orient the fabric so that the background piece is pointing towards the middle. Almost like we're putting legs on a star. And then that's going to be our block. Now all we have to do is sew this together like a typical 9-patch. We're going to sew row 1, row 2, and then row 3. And then we're going to sew row 1 to row 2 and row 2 to row 3. And it should be pretty quick. Let's get started. We just want to make sure that when we're doing this, we're taking a little bit of time to be careful about how our fabrics are oriented together. Make sure you're picking them up exactly as they were on your little design board. And I'm chain stitching mine together, so I'm sewing the pieces that were in the top left and the top center together. And then I'm going to sew the middle left and the middle center together without breaking thread. And then I'm going to sew my bottom left and my bottom center together. And then that's just going to kind of keep my 3 rows nice and tidy. Now I just take up the 3 pieces that are going to go on the end of each of those rows. Now I'm going to come back to the top and complete each of those rows, making sure that I keep the fabrics in the orientation that I had when they were on my design board. Don't want to turn any of these around. You want to be very careful that you're picking them up and sewing them together the exact way that they were when you laid this out. Now you got all this sewn together and we're just going to press it. So the top row, we're going to press the seams out. The middle row, we're going to press them in towards that center block. And then the bottom row, we're going to press them out. That's going to allow all of these seams to nest really nicely together when we sew our rows. And because I want these seams to be nice and flat when I put this block together, I'm actually going to take a second to really set these seams I just finger pressed with a nice hot dry iron. Okay, now all we have to do is sew our 3 rows together. Now when we sew this together, there are some places where we have points that we really don't want to lose if we can avoid it. So taking just a second to put a couple pins in the seam isn't a bad idea. So I'm just going to stab my pin through the point of that triangle so that it's held together here. and I'm going to stab it through the point of this triangle. And then I'm going to sew it together. And now I know wherever I see that pin start going through the fabric, that's where my points are. And if I just stay right at that spot, I shouldn't bury my points at all. So I'm just going to watch as my pin gets nice and close to the needle. I'm not going to pull it out all the way, but I am going to pull it enough that I can get a grip on it. And it looks like I'm not going to bury my point, but I might actually end up with a floating point. That's okay. This one I don't need because I can see the point over here. And I can just visually watch as it goes through that intersection. I love these pins. These are just big enough for patchwork. They are extra, extra fine, very, very sharp. They're heat resistant. They glide into fabric nicely. If you are looking for some good, sharp pins, I've got some of these in my Etsy store. Links in the description box below. Here's our final block. All we got to do is press this nice and flat. And at this point, I'm probably going to press it with a hot, dry iron, and then I'm going to take some steam to it. So this is our finished block. It actually wasn't too hard to sew at all. I love the effect that this darker green kind of gives to the block. It takes it to a whole nother level. I can't believe that this is block number 11. We only have one more block to do for the sampler quilt. Once that block's done, all we got to do is grab some sashing and some borders and then sew everything together, and we can get it quilted and have a nice quilt to snuggle up with. Thank you so much for joining me for this video today. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of this block. And if you're sewing along with me, don't forget to share a picture of your block. I'd love to see what it looks like. You can post it to the Becca's Babes group on Facebook or share it on social media with the hashtag Sew Becca Sampler. That's all I've got for this video, guys. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys all for block 12.